December 1st, 1948. Dawn breaks over Somerton Beach, Australia. A man is found dead, leaning peacefully against a seawall, as if he were merely resting. But the peace was an illusion. He had no wallet, no ID. Every single label had been meticulously cut from his clothing. In a secret pocket, police found a scrap of paper with 2 Persian words: Tamám Shud, it is ended. For 74 years, he was a ghost, a Cold War enigma that defeated cryptographers, spies, and private eyes. Today, we finally know his name, but his death remains one of the most chilling puzzles in history. The investigation began not with answers, but with a series of unsettling absences. When the police searched the pockets of the man on the sand, they expected the mundane debris of a human life, a driver's license, a letter, perhaps a photograph. Instead, they found a void. In his pockets lay an unused second-class railway ticket to Henley Beach and a bus ticket to St. Leonard's. There was an American aluminum comb, rare in Australia at the time, a half-empty pack of juicy fruit gum, and a pack of Army Club cigarettes. But even the cigarettes held a secret. Inside the Army Club pack were 7 Kensitas cigarettes, a more expensive brand. It was the first hint that this man was living behind a mask, or perhaps a series of masks. But the most disturbing discovery was what was not there. Every single label had been meticulously removed from his clothing. His tie, his coat, even his undershirt, all were stripped of their origin. This wasn't the work of a man in a hurry. It was the work of someone with surgical precision, determined to ensure that if his body was ever found, it would tell no stories. Only a single label remained, hidden on a pocket lining: T. Keane. Yet no Thomas Keane was missing in all Australia. The autopsy conducted by Dr. John Cleland only deepened the shadow. The man's physical condition was peak. He had the powerful, developed calf muscles of a dancer or an athlete, and his toes were strangely pointed, as if he spent his life in high fashion or riding boots. Internally, his body was a battlefield. His spleen was 3 times the normal size. His stomach was filled with blood. Cleland was convinced of poisoning, yet the man's face remained serene, showing no signs of the agony usually associated with toxins. And when the labs ran their tests, the results were impossible. No known poison was found. It was as if he had been struck down by a ghost, a substance so advanced or so rare that it left the science of 1948 staring into the dark. Who was this man, and why had someone gone to such lengths to erase his existence before he took his last breath?
4 months after the body was interred in a grave marked unknown, the case took a turn into the surreal. A local man came forward with a rare copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which he claimed to have found tossed into the back of his car on the very night of the death. The book was a relic of ancient Persian poetry, but it was what lay on the final page that sent chills through the precinct. A small piece of paper had been torn out, the very section that contained the poem's closing words, Tamám Shud. It was a perfect physical match for the scrap found hidden in the dead man's trousers. The connection was undeniable. This book had been in the hands of the Somerton Man in his final, lonely hours. But the back cover of the book held an even deeper enigma. Scrawled in faint pencil were 5 lines of capital letters, a code that seemed to defy every known rule of linguistics. Experts from the biological and cryptographic departments of the University of Adelaide spent months staring at these characters. They weren't just looking for a message, they were looking for a soul. Some believed the letters were the first initials of words from a personal poem, a private language shared between 2 people who could never be seen together. They looked for substitution ciphers, for any crack in the wall of letters, but they found nothing. To this day, the sequence remains one of the world's most famous uncracked ciphers. Beside the code was a faint phone number. It led detectives to a quiet beachside cottage in Glenelg, occupied by a young nurse known as Justin. When the police stood on her doorstep and showed her the plaster bust of the deceased, the air in the room changed. Justin didn't just look at the mask, she seemed to recoil from it, as if the dead man's eyes were still demanding an answer she wasn't prepared to give. Witnesses say she nearly fainted, her eyes locking on to the cold white features with a gaze of absolute, haunted recognition. The detectives noted every twitch of her hands, every avoided glance. Yet when she spoke, she denied everything. She claimed she didn't know him. She couldn't explain why her number was in his book. Her refusal to speak didn't just stall the investigation. It turned the Somerton Man into a permanent shadow in the history of Australian crime. A woman holding a secret that was heavier than the mystery itself.
The wall of silence surrounding the nurse, combined with the surgical precision used to remove the clothing labels, suggested something far more professional than a simple tragedy. In 1948, the world was freezing over into the Cold War. Australia was no longer just a distant island. It had become a strategic, high-stakes battlefield for global intelligence, a place where secrets were the most valuable and dangerous currency in existence. Just a few hundred miles from Somerton Beach sat the Woomera Long-Range Weapons Establishment. This was a top-secret facility where the British and Americans tested experimental rockets and intercepted Soviet signals. Woomera was the crown jewel of Western intelligence in the Southern Hemisphere, a site so sensitive that the mere mention of it in the wrong circles could lead to a government investigation. Because of this facility, Adelaide was crawling with operatives from every major power. The city was also a hub for the Venona Project, a massive clandestine effort between the United States and Australia to decrypt Soviet cables and expose sleeper agents. At the time of the Somerton Man's death, Venona was uncovering a massive spy ring within the Australian government. Tensions were at a breaking point. Was the Somerton Man a courier caught in the crossfire, a defector trying to disappear with a head full of high-altitude codes, or perhaps an operative whose time had suddenly run out in the most silent and efficient way possible? So great was the suspicion of espionage that the South Australian police took the unusual and costly step of creating a plaster bust of the man's head and shoulders before he was committed to the earth. This wasn't just a routine forensic record, it was a hauntingly accurate likeness intended to be shown to intelligence agencies across the globe. They hoped that by preserving his features, the high forehead, the distinct ears, the set of his jaw, an agent from some distant embassy in London, Washington, or Moscow might eventually crack under pressure and identify him. For years, this bust sat in a locked room, treated more like a piece of evidence from a crime against the state than a simple, unidentified body. The theory of espionage elegantly explained the undetectable poison that killed him. Experts suggested substances like digitalis or strephanthine, toxins that in 1948 were known to leave almost no trace in a standard autopsy. These were the tools of a professional assassin, designed to mimic a natural heart attack and leave no chemical signature behind. These poisons were favored by intelligence agencies because they allowed for plausible deniability, the ability to eliminate a target without ever proving a crime had been committed. It also explained why his fingerprints circulated to the FBI, Scotland Yard, and every military branch in the Commonwealth matched absolutely no one, as if he had been scrubbed from every official record on Earth, a man born of the shadows and returned to them by force. In the world of intelligence, if you cannot burn a body, you erase the man. The removal of the labels was a hallmark of tradecraft, a standard technique used by operatives to ensure their supply chain and country of origin could never be traced. Every stitch was a deliberate silence. Even the T. Kane label found in his suitcase was likely a red herring, a fake identity built to protect the real one. Every item in his possession, from the repacked cigarettes to the expensive American comb, pointed to a life built on layers of deception. For 70 years, the Somerton Man remained a ghost in a suit, a casualty of a secret war that officially he was never even a part of.
For decades, the case of the Somerton Man rested in the cold archives of the South Australian police, a silent relic of a forgotten era that refused to be buried. Generations of investigators grew old and retired, each haunted by the same face that stared back from that plaster mask. But while the human investigators faded, the echoes of the case never truly stopped. In 2021, after more than 73 years of absolute silence, the South Australian government finally granted permission for an act of scientific resurrection. They exhumed the body from its lonely grave in the West Terrace Cemetery, a site that had become a place of pilgrimage for amateur sleuths and historians alike. This was the one thing 1948 technology could never achieve: a conversation with the dead through the very blueprint of life. Professor Derek Abbott of the University of Adelaide, a man who had dedicated over a decade of his life to this singular obsession, teamed up with the world-renowned forensic genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick. They didn't look at old police files, blurred fingerprints, or missing person reports. Instead, they focused on the microscopic. By extracting degraded DNA from the hair caught in the original plaster bust, hair that had been preserved in the resin for over half a century, they began to build a genetic bridge across the chasm of time. This wasn't a search for a spy, it was a search for a family tree. Using the same revolutionary technology that had unmasked the Golden State Killer, they cross-referenced the Somerton Man's DNA with millions of profiles in public genealogical databases. They were looking for cousins, for siblings, for anyone who shared the blood of the ghost on the beach. In July 2022, the enigma finally had a face, a family, and a name. The man on the beach was not a Russian operative, a tragic poet, or a high-ranking defector. He was Carl Charles Webb, an electrical engineer from Melbourne. He wasn't born of the shadows, he was born in the suburbs. The discovery was both a relief and a new, deeper mystery. Records revealed a man who was far more complex than his unknown headstone suggested. Carl Webb was a man who enjoyed the cerebral challenge of poetry and the thrill of the horse races. He was a man with a troubled marriage to a woman named Dorothy Robertson, a relationship that had fractured just months before his disappearance. He had simply vanished from his life in Melbourne, leaving behind his tools, his wife, and his identity, only to reappear months later, dead on a beach 800 kilometers away, dressed in a suit that was not his own. This identification solved the who, but it deepened the why. Why did an electrical engineer carry a secret code? Why the suitcase full of meticulously unlabeled clothes? Some psychologists and historians believe Carl Webb was suffering from a profound mental breakdown, creating an elaborate, untraceable mystery as a final, spiteful act of defiance against the world that forgotten him. However, others point out that his technical skills as an engineer, specializing in the very electronics and wiring systems that defined the early Cold War, were exactly the kind of expertise that clandestine services were recruiting for during those post-war years. Was his death a suicide fueled by despair, or was Carl Webb a man who stepped into a world of shadows and found there was no way back out? As we look at the headstone in Adelaide that now at last bears the name Carl Webb, we are reminded that some secrets are not solved by science, they are only revealed. Carl Webb took his final truth to the grave, leaving us only with the Tamám Shud scrap as a final haunting message to the world, a message that simply means it is ended. But for us, the fascination with the man on the sand will never truly end.
Cases like this one remind us how fragile the line between ordinary life and unimaginable tragedy can be. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing to the Unsolved Echoes. Some stories never truly end. Thank you for watching.